The crisp morning air outside the White House felt electric as Karoline Leavitt, the sharp, no-nonsense White House press secretary, straightened her blazer. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the crowd of reporters waiting outside the press briefing room. Today was not just another day. It was the day she would defend one of the most controversial executive orders issued by President Donald Trump, a sweeping reform targeting judicial overreach. As she stepped onto the stage, flashes from the cameras flooded the room and the murmurs of the reporters died down. Karoline's confident stride and fierce reputation as a formidable communicator had made her a favorite within Trump's inner circle. She had been handpicked for moments exactly like this. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "Today, I am here to address the unprecedented criticism coming from the judicial branch regarding the president's recent executive order on federal judicial reform. The executive order, which sought to limit the influence of politically motivated judges and streamline the federal judicial process, had sparked outrage across the judicial spectrum. Most notably, Justices Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts had expressed deep concerns, publicly hinting that the order might overstep the boundaries of executive power. As Karoline continued, she noticed the skeptical eyes of the press corps. They were eager to pounce, to twist her words into a damaging headline. But she was ready. She had always been ready. "First, let's address Justice Barrett's recent remarks," Karoline said, her tone sharp yet composed. She stated that the president's executive order, quote, "poses a significant threat to judicial independence." "Well, I find it curious that a justice who has consistently championed originalism would suddenly object to a measure that aims to return our courts to their original constitutional function, free from political interference." The room went silent for a moment. Karoline's words hung in the air, a challenge thrown directly at the highest court in the land. She leaned into the podium, her eyes narrowing as she continued. "It is precisely this unchecked judicial activism that has strayed from the vision of our founding fathers. Judges were never intended to legislate from the bench. They were meant to interpret the law, not bend it to their personal political leanings," she said, her voice growing more intense. "This executive order does not threaten judicial independence. It protects it by ensuring that our laws reflect the will of the people, not the whims of unelected judges." The room was buzzing now. Karoline had struck a nerve, and the reporters could sense the stakes. She flipped the page of her notes, her mind racing through the hours of preparation she had put into this moment. She was determined to make it clear that the administration would not back down. "And as for Chief Justice Roberts," Karoline continued, her tone shifting to a more confrontational edge, "he has claimed that this executive order is an unprecedented assault on the judiciary. Well, I have news for the Chief Justice. The only unprecedented assault we've seen is the judicial overreach that has undermined the democratic process time and time again." A few gasps echoed through the room, and Karoline could see the furrowed brows of the White House correspondents. She was walking a tightrope, taking on the most powerful judges in the country, but she thrived on this kind of pressure. "I am here to set the record straight," Karoline said, her eyes locking with a particularly skeptical reporter in the front row. "This administration is not waging a war on the judiciary. We are restoring balance and integrity to it. And we will not be intimidated by those who hide behind black robes while rewriting the Constitution to fit their personal agendas." With that, she closed her binder and gave a firm nod. "I will take your questions now." The room erupted with shouts, a chaotic symphony of voices eager to challenge her. Karoline smiled. She had just fired the first shot in a battle that would define the Trump administration's legacy, and she had no intention of backing down. As the reporters' voices clashed over one another, Karoline remained calm, her fingers lightly gripping the edges of the podium. She chose a familiar face, Jake from the New York Times, whose sharp questions had often been a challenge. "Karoline," Jake began, his tone dripping with skepticism, "you've just accused two of the highest judges in this country of, essentially, judicial overreach. Don't you think it's a bit dangerous for the administration to be so openly confrontational with the Supreme Court?" Karoline leaned forward, eyes blazing with a mix of confidence and defiance. This was exactly the type of question she had prepared for. "Jake," she said, her tone firm but patient, "it is not dangerous to hold those in power accountable whether they wear a suit or a robe. In fact, it's the very foundation of our democratic system. This country was built on the principle of checks and balances, not unchecked power. The president's executive order simply seeks to ensure that the judiciary respects its constitutional limits." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Karoline cut him off, her words precise and deliberate. "And let's be clear about something else," she continued. Justice Barrett and Chief Justice Roberts have made a point of expressing their concern over the executive order, yet they conveniently ignore their own record of overstepping the boundaries of their office. She paused, letting her words sink in. The tension in the room was palpable, the collective breath of the press corps seemingly held in anticipation. Take, for example, Chief Justice Roberts' infamous ruling in the Affordable Care Act case, Karoline said, her eyes narrowing. He essentially rewrote the statute to save it, transforming a financial penalty into a tax just to fit his preferred outcome. That, my friends, is judicial activism at its finest. A few murmurs rippled through the room as reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Karoline wasn't just throwing punches, she was launching a full-scale offensive. And Justice Barrett, she added, her voice sharp and clear, has positioned herself as a constitutional originalist. Yet, when it came to recent decisions involving executive authority and states' rights, she has been more than willing to stretch the text of the Constitution to align with her personal ideology. We must call this out for what it is, a betrayal of the very judicial philosophy she claims to uphold. Jake shifted in his seat, clearly surprised by the forcefulness of Karoline's attack. But she wasn't finished. The president's executive order, she said, raising her voice slightly to cut through the whispers, is a necessary corrective. It restores the proper balance between the branches of government, ensuring that unelected judges cannot override the will of the people through creative interpretations of the law. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room. She could see the gears turning in the minds of the journalists before her, the subtle nods of those beginning to grasp her argument. I challenge anyone in this room, Karoline declared, her voice echoing off the marble walls, to find a single instance in this executive order that oversteps the president's constitutional authority. You won't find it because it simply isn't there. A stunned silence filled the briefing room. Karoline had done more than just defend the executive order, she had flipped the narrative, putting the Supreme Court itself on trial in the court of public opinion. As she scanned the room, her eyes locking with one skeptical face after another, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. This was her battleground, and she had just claimed the high ground. Next question, she said, her tone sharp and unyielding as she prepared to dismantle the next wave of opposition with the same precision she had just displayed. Karoline adjusted the microphone, her pulse steady despite the intensity of the room. She pointed to a journalist from CNN, a network known for its critical stance on the Trump administration. The reporter, a tall man with neatly combed hair and a determined expression, leaned forward as he took his turn. Karoline, he began, his tone a mix of challenge and curiosity, even if the executive order you're defending is technically within the president's constitutional powers, isn't it setting a dangerous precedent by essentially intimidating the judiciary into compliance? Karoline smiled, recognizing the familiar line of attack. She had heard this argument countless times in the prep sessions leading up to today's briefing. Intimidation, she echoed, leaning into the podium. I find it ironic that those who claim to be defenders of democracy are suddenly worried about intimidation when the executive branch exercises its legitimate constitutional authority. Where was this concern when judges were striking down executive actions without constitutional basis? The reporter opened his mouth to interject, but Karoline pressed on, her tone growing sharper. Let's talk about precedents, she said, locking eyes with him. For decades, we've seen a slow but steady erosion of the separation of powers, with judges acting as de facto lawmakers. This executive order doesn't threaten the judiciary, it restores its proper role. She took a step back from the podium, her eyes sweeping the room as she laid out her next point. Take the case of the travel ban in 2017, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roberts, eventually upheld the ban, but not before lower courts repeatedly overstepped their bounds to block a clear exercise of executive authority in matters of national security. That was real intimidation, using judicial power to undermine the constitutional authority of the presidency. A ripple of murmurs spread through the press corps, a sign that her words were hitting their mark. Karoline's confidence grew as she continued. And let's not forget the recent rulings on Second Amendment rights, she added, shifting her gaze to another section of the room. Justice Barrett, despite her originalist stance, has been willing to entertain limits on gun ownership that clearly conflict with the plain text of the Constitution. This is the very definition of judicial overreach, and yet we're the ones accused of intimidation. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. The journalists were scribbling furiously, the soft scratch of pens on notepads a constant reminder that every word she said would be dissected in the evening news cycle. The truth is, Karoline continued, her tone turning fierce, this administration is doing what it was elected to do, stand up for the American people against an unaccountable judicial elite. We are not intimidated by robes and gavels, and we will not be silenced by those who seek to twist our laws to fit their personal politics. She could see the reporters exchanging glances, some nodding, others frowning, as they tried to find a weakness in her argument. But Karoline wasn't finished yet. And let me add this, she said, leaning back into the microphone. The president's executive order is not a power grab. It is a necessary correction to decades of judicial drift. We are simply reminding the courts that their job is to interpret the law as it is written, not as they wish it were. A moment of silence passed, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Next question, Karoline said, her voice crisp and unyielding as she prepared to face the next volley in this escalating war of words. A hush fell over the room as Karoline scanned the sea of faces before her. She could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the nation upon her, waiting to see if she would falter. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't just holding the line. She was pushing it forward. She pointed to a young reporter from Politico, a sharp-dressed woman with a piercing gaze. The reporter wasted no time, leaning into her microphone. Karoline, you've spoken passionately about the dangers of judicial overreach, but don't you worry that this executive order risks eroding the independence of the judiciary? Isn't that a fundamental threat to our democracy? Karoline's jaw tightened for a brief moment. She had expected this line of questioning, but the timing was strategic, aimed at casting her as an authoritarian enabler. She straightened her shoulders, her eyes flashing with resolve. Thank you for the question, she began, her voice clear and steady. But let's be precise about what we mean by judicial independence. Judicial independence does not mean judges are free to rewrite the Constitution or create laws out of thin air. It means they are free to interpret the law as it is written, without political pressure. That's exactly what this executive order seeks to protect. The reporter opened her mouth to follow up, but Karoline cut her off, her words sharp and precise. And let's not pretend that our judiciary is a monolithic institution, free from political influence. Karoline continued, her tone gaining intensity. Chief Justice Roberts himself has lamented the growing perception of the Supreme Court as a political body, yet he continues to make rulings that reflect political considerations rather than strict constitutional interpretation. That's the real threat to our democracy. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Karoline had just put the Chief Justice's credibility on the line, a bold move that few in her position would dare attempt. But she wasn't done. And Justice Barrett, she said, her eyes narrowing, who claims to be an originalist, has made rulings that bend the very principles she claims to champion. This is not independence, it's inconsistency. And the American people deserve better. She leaned into the podium, her voice dropping to a sharp, deliberate tone. We are not trying to control the courts, she said firmly. We are trying to restore their integrity. We are saying that judges must respect the limits of their power, just as the President and Congress must respect theirs. A few gasps echoed through the room as her words struck home. Karoline could feel the momentum shifting, the tide turning in her favor. And let me remind everyone here, she said, her voice rising, that the judiciary is not above the Constitution. It is bound by it. And when judges overstep their bounds, it is the duty of the executive and legislative branches to check that power. That is not an attack on the judiciary, it is a defense of our Constitution. She paused, letting the silence stretch, her eyes daring anyone to challenge her. We will not be intimidated, she said, her voice sharp and clear. We will not be silenced. And we will not back down from defending the constitutional principles that this nation was built upon. The room fell silent once again, the tension so thick it felt like a living thing. Karoline had just thrown down the gauntlet, her words echoing through the halls of power like the crack of a judge's gavel. She took a deep breath, her pulse steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had made her point and she had made it clearly. Now it was up to the media to decide how they would respond. Next question, she said, her voice unwavering as she prepared for the final rounds of this high-stakes press briefing. The room remained charged with tension and Karoline knew she had struck a nerve. She had defended the executive order with logic and precision, exposing the contradictions within the judicial branch while standing firm on constitutional principles. Now it was time to solidify the victory. She called on a seasoned correspondent from Fox News, an older man with a deep, booming voice. He nodded respectfully before speaking. Karoline, you've made a compelling case for the executive order. But there's a growing debate about whether this move could provoke a constitutional crisis, especially if the Supreme Court decides to rule against it. What's the administration's position on that potential outcome? Karoline smiled subtly. She had been waiting for this question. That's an important point, she said, her voice firm. Let me be absolutely clear, this administration respects the Constitution and the role of the Supreme Court in interpreting the law. However, we also have a responsibility to challenge decisions that overstep judicial boundaries. If the Supreme Court rules against the executive order, we will evaluate that decision carefully. But we will not abandon our commitment to upholding the constitutional framework that guides this nation. She glanced around, making sure the gravity of her statement was understood. This is not about defiance, she continued. It's about holding every branch accountable, including the judiciary. We will pursue all legal avenues to defend this order because it's about restoring balance, not undermining it. As Karoline took a sip of water, a young reporter from NPR raised her hand cautiously. Karoline nodded, signaling her to go ahead. Karoline, she said thoughtfully, you've made a powerful argument about judicial overreach, but can you address the critics who say that by directly challenging Justices Barrett and Roberts, you're making this personal rather than policy-driven? Karoline leaned forward, her expression softening just slightly. It's a fair question, she conceded. But let's get one thing straight, this is not about personalities. It's about principles. Justice Barrett and Chief Justice Roberts are public servants, and when they make rulings that affect the entire nation, they are accountable for those decisions. It's not personal to point out inconsistencies in their judicial philosophies, especially when those inconsistencies undermine the Constitution. She paused, her tone growing more thoughtful. In fact, by holding them accountable, we are respecting the role of the judiciary, not diminishing it. Public discourse on legal decisions is not an attack. It's a necessary part of a healthy democracy. We owe it to the American people to challenge rulings that we believe are misguided or constitutionally unsound. The NPR reporter nodded, seemingly satisfied with the nuanced response. Karoline glanced at the clock, realizing the briefing had stretched far longer than planned. But she wasn't done yet. She needed to end on a high note, one that left no doubt about the administration's resolve. As we move forward, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, I want the American people to know that this administration will never shy away from defending constitutional integrity. We are not at war with the judiciary, we are at war with judicial activism. There's a difference, and we intend to make it clear at every opportunity. She scanned the room one last time, noticing that even her harshest critics seemed momentarily quiet, processing her words. We will continue to push for reforms that uphold the balance of power, just as our founders intended. And we will not be bullied into silence by those who believe their interpretation is the only valid one. The Constitution belongs to the people, not to a select few who wear robes and wield gavels. With that, Karoline gave a firm nod, signaling the end of the briefing. The reporters remained seated, still jotting down notes, some exchanging glances as if they had just witnessed a historical moment. As Karoline stepped down from the podium and headed back toward the hallway, a fellow staffer whispered, "That was intense. You really went after them." Karoline gave a faint smile, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. Sometimes you have to remind people that just because someone has power doesn't mean they're above accountability. As she walked away, she could hear the faint sound of reporters still buzzing about her statements. She knew the headlines would be polarizing. Some would praise her for standing firm, while others would condemn her for taking on the judiciary so directly. But Karoline Leavitt didn't care about pleasing everyone. She cared about the truth, and today she had delivered it with the full force of her unwavering conviction. Back in her office, she glanced at the framed quote on the wall from President Trump himself. "Never back down when you know you're right." Karoline knew this battle was far from over, but today she had drawn the line, and no one would forget it.